Morning, and thank you for joining us today. A special thanks to Speaker Adrian Adams for being with us today, our distinguished panelists who you'll meet, and Legal Momentum and PowHer New York for being such incredible partners in making today a reality. The Community Service Society has worked with and for New Yorkers for over 180 years. I wasn't there at the beginning, though some people are starting to suggest. We've worked to promote economic opportunity and champion an equitable city and state. We use rigorous research, direct services, and advocacy to make New York a more equitable place. And an immediate imperative for achieving this vision requires closing the gender pay gap, which deprives millions of women, and particularly women of color, from achieving economic security. In our fact sheet, which is hot off the presses, no one else has seen it, entitled The Next Step in the Fight for Pay Equity, we show that New York's gender and racial wage gap persists despite strong pay equity laws in New York City and state. New York has made strides in recent years, banning the use of salary history in determining pay, affirming workers' right to discuss pay with their coworkers, and passing groundbreaking salary range transparency laws. Yet women working full-time in New York still earn just 88 cents for every dollar earned by their male counterparts. Women of color fare much worse. Black women earn 66 cents, and Latinas women only 59 cents for every dollar earned by white non-Hispanic men. Building on recent progress made to strengthen and expand pay transparency across the state, we hope to finally close these persistent pay gaps. Our speakers and panelists here with us today have been in the forefront of the fight for gender and racial pay equity. We are especially thankful, again, for New York City Council Speaker Adams and the City Council, who have prioritized addressing inequities in the city's workforce, passing legislative packages to confront the historic lack of diversity in the fire department. I should digress here. I've been fighting with the fire department for now 15, 20 years, because it is in some ways the worst big city fire department in terms of bringing in both women and people of color. And it's been extraordinarily fight. And we have a federal lawsuit that was won, and still it's entrenched. So this is a little bit of passion on this. We know the mayor's office, including the Commission on Racial Equity and Justice and Gender Equity Commission, have also been in the fore addressing gender disparities. Without further ado, I'm happy to get this event started and passing the baton to our next speaker and partner in the effort, Beverly Newfield. She's president and founder of PowHer New York, and has been a lifelong advocate for women and girls, driving the movement for economic equality in New York. She co-created and leads an 18-year-old equal pay campaign, which advanced New York City and New York State salary history and pay transparencies law. Bev has been instrumental in pushing forward the pro-women policy reform in New York State and City, which has resulted in legislative victories and transformative change. Now, I hope you join me in welcoming Bev.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David, for that introduction, but really for hosting us this morning. It means a lot to be in a space, an organization that is really historic in its work around equity. And so being here is very, very special. The pamphlet, we started out as a fact sheet, but now we have a pamphlet, and that was the absolute collaboration of Legal Momentum, PowHer, and Community Service Society, and bringing us all together is where we find strength. Well, Just 2 weeks ago, we were on the steps of City Hall. It was a bright, sunny day, and we were all wearing red, and speakers with us, and it was really very special. But I can tell you that 18 years ago, the picture was very, very different. We were just a handful of women on the steps of City Hall, and we actually didn't really know that much about equal pay. But in those years, so much has changed. Our numbers have increased. The conversation is so much louder. People didn't talk about equal pay then, and now it's mainstream. It's really mainstream. And this last Equal Pay Day showed that every paper, every outlet was talking about equal pay. Our equal pay campaign has grown from 12 groups to 100, and our elected officials are right with us in making this happen. We have, as you said, David, we've had passed a host of laws. Some of them are over there, protecting workers from retaliation, expanding the definition of equal pay to equal pay for substantially similar work. And then also covering more people by these laws, not just gender, but race and ethnicity, because the wage gap is really an issue that's intersectional, and we have to approach it that way. Yes, we banned and you can't use salary ranges when setting job categories. Excuse me, the salary history ban, that stopped asking that question. But the most important has been the salary range disclosure law. It just broke things open, and it actually, it caused like a tsunami across the country of other places passing similar laws. So what happens in New York is extremely important. I also want to point out that New York City government is also at the forefront of the country. And that's because there was, again, a result of a lawsuit with CWA Local 1180, who've been very strong partners in this work. And they had a 30-year wage discrimination lawsuit and campaign. So it might take a little bit longer, David, but they did win. And one of the results was what was something that'll be, the commissioner will talk about, is the analysis of all the pay data for the municipal workforce. This is unique for the country, and it's really extraordinary. We've also passed 2 laws up in Albany that will require businesses to report their equal pay data. And guess what? We did that all, and we had a pandemic. So this is how strong this urge, this need is to solve the problem. The wage gap persists. New York is the 3rd in the country with the smallest wage gap. But for women of color, we are doing just as badly as most of the other states, which is unconscionable. You can see that, as you said, David, the numbers are really stark for women of color, but the numbers of impact on their lives are shocking. Women can lose between $11,000 and $34,000 a year, depending on their background. That's completely unacceptable. And we think we can imagine what people's lives would be like if they did have those resources. Women are continuing to be pushed into pink-collar jobs that are undervalued and underpaid, which is a big part of the wage gap. And they're not always welcomed in the green economy or in the trade jobs. So we have to fix that too. So what is next? How do we crack the hold that pay inequity has on our society? And from our panel today, you will hear about the economic realities of New York City women, the new laws that are helping, but they're flawed, the groundbreaking data analysis that is happening right now and is so unusual and important, and the role that business can play in solving this problem. The progress today only happened because of collaboration, collective work, and partnership. And I want to point out and thank CSS, but also Legal Momentum, WCC, Catalyst, A Better Balance. They were all part of this, CWA, SAG-AFTRA as well. So this is how people come together to make change in these systemic problems. And but you can't get anything done if you don't have the right people at the helm. if you don't have the elected officials who are willing to stand up with you, to speak out on all those equal pay days and speak out on the floor in Albany and New York City. And we have someone here today who is just the epitome of advocacy for equity. And we're so proud to have the first female city council head of a majority council now, which is amazing. Also at the forefront of equity, unequivocally advances pro-women, pro-choice agenda, and always stands with us on the steps of City Hall. I'm so happy to introduce our speaker, Adrienne Adams. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev. And it was a sunny day the last time we were all together on those steps of City Hall. And, you know, like I said, when we were out there, you know, we're all still shining. So regardless of the weather, we're all still shining. And good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you, of course, David Jones and CSS for all that you do. Thank you, Bev and PowHer and Legal Momentum for gathering us today to grow our increasingly powerful and unrelenting movement to achieve pay equity. You know, my name is Adrienne E. Adams, and I'm putting the E for equity today. So, so we're gonna like change my middle name. My middle name's really Elizabeth, but we're gonna make it equity today. So I do have the honor, the distinct honor of leading our very first women majority in the history of the city of New York. I'm actually, Bev, the third woman, but the first Black woman, mother, wife, grandmother, the total package. So they just got the total package, and I don't know if that's good or bad, or some folks say it's bad, some folks say it's great. So we're just gonna say it's stupendous for all of us in this room and what we still strive to achieve, and that is pay equity. I want to acknowledge Commissioner Sherman. Good morning. It's great to see you today. All the members of the panel, thank you for being here today. As a woman majority legislative body, our focus has been creating and advancing policies that uplift women, because women truly are the cornerstone of our society and the backbone of our families. When women have equal access to opportunities, we all succeed. Yet, as was mentioned, women are woefully underpaid compared to their male counterparts. The data is even more devastating when you scrutinize it by race. Here in New York, working women earn 78 cents on the dollar compared to a man in the exact same position. And as I mentioned on the steps a few weeks ago, Bev, I'm still waiting for my dollar. You know, it's been a long time. I'm still waiting for my dollar. The disparities are even wider for women of color. Asian American women earn 70 cents for every dollar earned by a white man. Black women earn 63 cents, and Latino women earn just 50 cents. That means that over a lifetime, what a man makes by age 60, a woman will have to work an additional 3 to 30 years to earn the same. We can't allow this to go on. Something has to give. The gender wage gap impacts the well-being of our families, our communities, and our economy. By working together, we can end these pay disparities once and for all. Last year, the council enacted new laws to provide key data and analysis on pay disparities in the municipal workforce. With year-round access to pay data, the council can now conduct stronger oversight to narrow persistent pay gaps. We will continue to build on this progress and work to achieve a fairer and more equitable workforce that breaks down occupational segregation. That way, we can pay all workers fair wages and equitably compensate the underpaid women who make up over half of our frontline and municipal workforce. New York City runs on the labor of women and working people. It is in everyone's best interest to uplift us and help ensure that all women are able to build sustainable careers, especially as a women majority in the most diverse council in the city's history. Achieving pay equity is personal to us and to our constituents. We know the transformative impact this can make in our communities. And that's why we will never let up, ever let up. And we're going to continue this fight until all of us are paid what we deserve. Ladies and gentlemen, I want my dollar. We're all in great company today. Looking forward to this wonderful panel. I'm excited for all of us to share and learn from each other. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was so blown away by that statement. Really, it's that kind of, intensity that we need to really move this forward. We're dealing with societal pressure, societal issues. This is historic. It's biblical almost. And so it's that kind of response that we need, to really tackle this. So we have an amazing panel for you to talk about different aspects of this, as I pointed out. And to moderate the panel, we have CSS's own VP of Policy and Advocacy, Amarita Torres.
Thank you so much. As a note to our panelists, to speak into the mic, you just have to push the button and make it green. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at CSS today. My name is Amarita Torres. I'm the VP for Policy at CSS. Honored to be here to moderate today's discussion on next steps in the fight for pay equity. We have a distinguished group of panelists, of leaders here with us today, representing government, advocates, law and policy, and the private sector. So this is a complex issue, and so we're really excited to have the different perspectives here to really grapple with this issue today. I'm going to make some very brief introductions because you have the speakers' bios in front of you. And then we're going to jump into the discussion, and we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, so get ready for your questions. Get your questions prepared. First, we have Lorraine Harrington. She's the president and CEO of Catalyst, a global nonprofit working with some of the most prominent CEOs and leading companies to help build workplaces that work for women. She's worked with many companies on increasing the representation of women in leadership, deepening the understanding of workplace inclusion, and equipping companies around the world to remedy inequities across intersections of identity. Next, we have Seher Khwaja, the Director of Economic Justice and Deputy Legal Director of Legal Momentum, the Women Legal's Defense and Education Fund. Her work spans litigation, policy advocacy, and educational outreach to advance gender equity. And Seher has been a driving force in drafting and helping to enact pay transparency legislation in New York. Next, we have Commissioner Sadia Sherman, New York City Chief Equity Officer and Commissioner of the New York City Mayor's Office of Equity and Justice. Commissioner Sherman leads the city's efforts to advance equity through policy, practice, and programs. She has spent decades inside and outside of government in executive positions, advancing equity and justice in New York City. And finally, we have Sharon Sewell-Fairman, the President and CEO of Women Creating Change, WCC. Sharon is leading the charge in empowering women, advancing gender equity, and advocating for policy changes that positively impact communities. She has over 25 years of workforce and economic development experience at the local, state, and national levels. So we're so excited to have you. Let's get started. I'd love to start first to discuss the landscape, the complexity of the issue that we face today, the gravity of it. When it comes to the gender pay gap, we know it's complex. And I want to turn to Sharon first to kick us off. Women Creating Change published a groundbreaking report this past November in partnership with the New School Center for New York City Affairs. The report was extensive, and one of the conclusions was that while progress has been made with respect to closing the wage gap since the U.S. Equal Pay Law was passed in 1963, progress has stalled, particularly over the last 25 years. So Sharon, if you can tell us a little bit about the main findings of your report and particularly what is driving this lack of progress.
Sure. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome, especially on this rainy morning. As Marita said, my name is Sharon Sewell-Fairman. I'm the president and CEO of Women Creating Change, and I've been there for about a year. I spent over 30 years in workforce development, and that's what brought me to this position here. I've seen a lot across industries in terms of gender pay inequity. I am delighted to be here. I want to thank Bev Neufeld at PowHer for inviting me to participate in this discussion, and I want to thank you all for being here. Before I get started, I just want to quickly say WCC's mission is to advance gender equity and to increase civic engagement, participation, and activism among women across New York City, especially women of color. It is with that lens, we also have identified 5 pillars that really drive and affect women issues. And that is economic justice, which we're here to talk about. We have education. We also have environment, safety, right? And health and reproductive rights. So the report, it comes under the economic justice pillar. And the bottom line is we really wanted to examine gender pay equity and how it has changed in New York City, the state, and compared to US overall. As Marita said, the Equal Pay Act was signed into law 61 years ago. And though we have progressed, made great strides over the 25 years, gains in pay equity have slowed and even stalled. And the lens that I give you is from New York City specifically, and you'll see slightly different numbers, but the findings are essentially the same. In 1997, the gender pay ratio was 92% in New York City. And that's meaning full-time women workers earn 92 cents for every dollar earned by a man. In the same year, that ratio was 83 cents in New York State and 81 cents nationally. But here we are, 25 years later, in 2022, in the US overall, that ratio has improved just 6% and 5% in the state. But in New York City, it has fallen 2%. So we've seen too slow gains on the state level and at stalling out at the city level. So what's happening in terms of the women? As you heard, you saw the numbers. We found that the gender pay gap is much higher for women of color, of course. For every dollar white man earns, white women earn 86 cents on the dollar, Asian women 72 cents on the dollar, Black women 57 cents on the dollar, and Hispanic Latina women only 54 cents on the dollar. So when we focus on what's happening, why is this happening? We think that, or we found that, as CM Adams talked about, its continued occupational segregation and the growth in low-wage jobs. And those things are very much linked. Women are overrepresented, for example, as home health aides, human services workers, and childcare workers. These occupations are also growing fast. Over the past 20 years, care work has grown by 56%. At the same time, men remain overrepresented in high-wage jobs, especially tech and finance. These fields, despite the layoffs this year, have been growing. And I also want to add in here too that the research also found that women in high-wage jobs still get lower pay than their white counterpart. As a matter of fact, it's much lower at 77 cents on the dollar. So the growth of low-wage female-dominated jobs is parallel with growth of higher-wage male-dominated fields, further drives apart the overall gender gap. And I will wrap up by saying there are many other contributors to the gender pay gap, which our panelists, of course, will talk about, but lack of networks, the motherhood penalty, the fact that women often leave the workforce to care for family and then return, having missed crucial years when they could have climbed the ladder. There's also the second shift, and we all have experienced the second shift. Or the extra domestic labor that women do after paid work outside the home, which restricts our ability to network, work overtime, or travel, all of which, again, help you advance up the ladder. And finally, after accounting for occupational segregation and time out of the workforce, there's a gender discrimination, and which also tends to hit hardest with women who face intersectional bias as women of color, gender non-conforming women, or women with disabilities. So when you look over time, as been discussed before, I think FPA has coined this economic deprivation, right? The lack of economic security. And so we look at it through the lens is that if women have to take care of their children, and in many cases, their aging parents, right? The sandwich generation, and still get low wages, it's harder for them to participate and to self-advocate for themselves, for their communities, for their families. And so I'm excited about this discussion this morning because I do think gender pay, the transparency law is important for highlighting that disparity, but more importantly, equipping us to advance gender equity across the state and across New York.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon. You mentioned the second shift that resonates. I'm a new mom, so I work that second shift a lot. And I really appreciate your points. I don't think we talk about it enough on occupational segregation and where women lie across the economy. I want to turn to Seher. We talked about the equal pay law, and there are many laws that we want to talk about today. And many laws and regulations that have passed to remedy some of these disparities that Sharon mentioned in New York City and New York State on pay equity and pay transparency. Seher has been working on this for many years with Legal Momentum and working to close the pay parity gap. So I wanted to turn to Seher, if you can tell us a little bit about what are some of the most critical pay transparency laws in New York that have been passed recently, and what do they seek to achieve?
Thanks, Amarita. First, I just want to take a step back to thank the Community Service Society for bringing us here, bringing us together, working with us. I want to thank PowHer and Bev. I think it's important to acknowledge that we wouldn't be where we are in New York State without Bev and PowHer and the amazing work that she's done to bring together so many people in this movement for change. And I just want to say I'm privileged to be on this incredible panel of women and people who are part of this movement to bring us forward. So in terms of thinking about pay transparency, I think it's really important to first acknowledge what we've already heard, which is that our federal and state equal pay laws have been on the books for decades, and for decades they have mandated equal pay for equal work. In New York State, we've made important reforms to that law. The law now mandates equal pay for substantially similar work, and it's not just based on gender, it's based on all the protected characteristics, including race and ethnicity. And yet we are still facing a very stagnant, persistent pay gap. And there's several reasons why this pay gap has persisted. I think we need to recognize that our existing equal pay laws, and I will stress that they are absolutely essential, but insufficient because they place the onus on the person who has been wronged, who is already suffering a pay inequity, to bring litigation to correct that wrong, right? It's not placing the onus on the wrongdoer or the employer, and that's a big problem. I think our lawsuits are also, to bring a lawsuit is very costly. It's costly financially, it's costly reputationally. I think for women who have done it, they know that it's an incredibly uphill battle. Litigation takes years. There are very high rates of retaliation. So in addition to, again, suffering from the pay disparity, you are suffering this additional emotional harm to having to really fight to be paid what's due to you. Additionally, what we know is that, and this is what I call the absurdity of our equal pay law, which is we have outlawed unequal pay for equal work, and yet employers can still withhold the information, the very basic information you need to determine whether a pay disparity exists. And that's why we've seen this kind of Lilly Ledbetter effect across the country, across New York. Women don't know when they're being paid unequally. And what we're seeing is that they're finding out from picking up a sheet in the copying machine, you know, these random ways in which they're finding out that for decades they've been paid unfairly. And that's wrong, right? There's no reason why employers should be allowed to withhold that information to establish whether or not there's pay inequity. So I think these issues have essentially created what we see as an accountability gap. Our existing equal pay laws have not created the incentive for employers to be accountable and to change their pay practices. And so I think this is where pay transparency really comes in, why it's so essential towards addressing the pay gap. And so there's several ways in which pay transparency really helps us to address the accountability gap. And when I say pay transparency, there are many different types of laws. What I'm primarily kind of talking about today are laws that mandate disclosure of pay ranges to both applicants and to existing employees. So first, I think by forcing employers to make a determination about what the pay range should be upfront, and by making those pay ranges visible to the public, essentially, we are forcing employers to base pay ranges and their pay practices on objective factors, as opposed to making these ad hoc candidate-specific decisions, which we know employers make and which we know are the entry point for discriminatory bias, oftentimes based on gender and race. And so, you know, we talked about the second shift. Employers oftentimes judge women to be less reliable, not as good at their jobs. And a lot of that comes from the fact that women have to cut out in the middle of the day because their child is sick. You know, they have to go take leave for several months because they've had a baby. This is the reality. This is the motherhood penalty that we're talking about. And so those biases have been kind of infused into how pay is set for women and for women of color in particular. I think another important piece of pay transparency is that it gives the most vulnerable workers leverage that they haven't had for so many years. And we've passed a salary history ban because we know that basing future salary on prior salary is discriminatory, because women and people of color salary have been artificially depressed over the years. And so when you're using that prior salary, you are perpetuating that discrimination. And what we're seeing is that for the first time with pay transparency, women are not necessarily negotiating against themselves, because what they had before to go into salary negotiations was their prior salary. Now they have an actual range that, again, we're hoping will move towards looking at objective factors and not on bias. And so this is a game changer for people when they are trying to push for a salary that's fair and that's right. We've talked a lot about occupational segregation, which is, you know, as Sharon mentioned, one of the key drivers of the pay gap. Pay transparency also serves a really important role in disrupting occupational segregation, because again, for decades, women have been coming to the table not knowing what pay is in various different industries. And what pay transparency does is it allows those who are most vulnerable in our economy to make better, more informed decisions about what industries and employers and jobs to pursue, because they have a better sense of what people are paying. And I'll say too, and this is really important, when we pass this legislation, we really stress this is a law for everyone. This is a law for women at the high spectrum of pay and for women at the low spectrum of pay. For low-wage workers, pay transparency serves several roles. One, we hope that it pushes employers to, again, they have to post that, the pay they're going to offer, even if it's the minimum wage. We hope that discourages them from paying less than the minimum wage behind closed doors. But more importantly, it allows low-wage workers to identify which employers pay a living wage and which employers don't. And that's a really important factor in today's economy. I'll briefly say just that I know we want to talk about what our pay transparency law in New York City, New York State does. And just very briefly, it now mandates employers with 4 or more employees to disclose pay ranges upfront in all advertisements for jobs, promotions, and transfer opportunities. And it requires employers to post what we refer to as a good faith salary range.
Thank you, Sahara. Thank you, Sahara. So much to unpack there. I really appreciated so many of your points, but especially on this accountability gap and how women, it sets us up to no longer negotiate against ourselves, which is really important. Something that you talked about, the salary transparency laws that have passed, but also it sounds like we need a lot of data for this. We need a lot of accountability. We need a lot of data collection and analysis. So I wanted to turn to Commissioner Sherman. The City Council passed a law recently, fairly recently, 2019, I believe, Local Law 18, which requires New York City to analyze pay disparities based on race, gender, ethnicity, and other protected classes amongst New York City employees. This is a big deal. New York City has over 400,000, I believe, New York City municipal employees. That's larger than the city of New Orleans. Commissioner, we know that this is an area of your work, and as you lead as well, the Commission on Gender Equity. So I'd love to learn a little more about the implementation of this law and what you've learned so far with the data collection and what's been done to date.
Sure. Good morning. Good morning. And I want to echo my sentiments and gratitude for being here this morning. And I also want to acknowledge you, Speaker Adams, for your leadership on this issue. Many of those local laws that we're discussing are laws that were passed in this council. So, this is an issue that carries great urgency for this administration. When you think about the magnitude of the city workforce, as well as the fact that it's largely composed of people of color, of women, of folks who live in the same communities that we're trying to focus on and prioritize and serve across our city. Our ability to achieve pay equity not only has an economic impact on our employees, but our city at large. So this is something that's personally, very close and near and dear to me, but certainly has been a priority within this administration. So Sahir laid out in very great detail, right? The number of laws that we have in our city and in our state too, right? That promote pay transparency and pay equity. And would also just lift up, right? New York has some of the strongest human rights law protections. We have 29 protected classes, height and weight are the most recently added. Fair work week, right? Paid sick leave, a number of protections for workers, but we still see these disparities. So Local Law 18 requires that the city report publicly its pay disparity data. This is produced by the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics. It's a report that's issued to the City Council. And if you look at the 2022 report, what you'll see is that, there are actually, because our civil service system has a lot of rigidity, right, for better or for worse, there are ways in which the civil service system actually minimizes those gaps, where you actually see comparable compensation across gender and race based on certain titles. But when you look across occupations, right, that's when you start to see these deep disparities, because there's occupational segregation within our city workforce. And so while we have strong laws and strong protections, this requires action by employers to actually proactively address, right? To your point, many of our laws require the people who are being harmed to raise these issues and take action, but it requires employers and the city as an employer to actively address this. So when you think about occupational segregation, there are 2 ways you can approach this. One is, right, this could be a recruitment challenge. This can be a career exposure challenge. This can be reducing barriers that we have for certain titles within city employment. The other way to look at it is, are we actually valuing all jobs appropriately, right? So, there's been a lot of effort by the city
to address the challenges that we have in recruitment. I think just yesterday, the city and our colleagues at DCAS were proud to announce, right, reducing some barriers to civil service titles so that more people have an entryway into city employment. There have been a number of, upskilling HR teams, working on diverse recruitment practices, a number of efforts to really bring in employees across more occupations within city government. The work that we're also doing within our office and the Commission on Gender Equity through our Pay Equity Cabinet, which is co-chaired by DCAS, which is the city's Department of Administrative Services, as well as the Commission on Gender Equity, is pursuing a pay equity evaluation, right? Which takes the information that the city's already providing by local law, but has a deeper analysis on not are we, paying people equally for equal work, but are we paying people for work of equal value? How are we actually valuing jobs, right? The biases that we bake in based on race and gender carry out in our occupations, the way in which we value the work that's largely dominated by women, by people of color. The values that we assign to that, whether it's within government or within the private sector, are baked into those roles. And so what we have underway right now is actually bringing on third-party partners to help us with that analysis over multiple years, starting with titles where we see large gaps, starting with titles that we know are dominated by women and people of color, and proactively producing that reporting and that analysis to go beyond even what we're required to do presently, right? So that we as a city can begin to really understand the magnitude of the gaps and use that to think about a comparable compensation system, right? Which is a very different way of addressing pay equity. That is work that's starting, it's underway, and one of my colleagues is here because I think we still have a solicitation out, so we'll make sure that we get that information out to folks who are interested in working with us. But that's work that's underway, and we're really excited to pursue that. But we know that, right, here and now, our municipal workforce, our colleagues by extension, right, our human service partners, right, who are also, certainly part of the web of services that are delivered across our city, also need, right, compensation and relief now. And so we're certainly excited to see, right, many of the collective bargaining agreements that were negotiated in this administration, the recent cost of living adjustment, and also our partnership in the council, right, to see human service workers also have their compensation raised, right, as we still continue to pursue this deeper analysis of some of the inequities that may be baked in, even when we have systems that are designed to produce relatively equitable pay.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I was really happy to hear about the Pay Equity Cabinet and also a lot of your focus on occupational segregation and the action of employers. So I want to move to Lorraine. We're talking about employers here. We talked about the city's workforce. Let's talk about the private sector. In New York City, we have over 4 million private sector jobs. And Lorraine, you've worked for decades with the business community on a variety of issues, from wage equity to women's representation and trying to get companies to do the right thing for women. So I'd love to hear from you on, what's been the business community's response to this, response to laws, response to implementation, to data collection and reporting, and have these laws been successful from your point of view?
First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And especially to see the level of commitment that the city has around these issues. And I think it's really important because I think New York really leads the way and can set the example not only for the city and do the right things for the employees in the city, but also, around the country and around the globe. And particularly, within the city workers, that's such a great place to do some of this occupational segregation work, that's so much harder for the private sector to do. But, when you see this, this undertaken, it sets the tone. I also think, in Europe, there's a lot more focus on this, and I think it's great partners for us to look at what they're doing in Europe. So like in the EU recently passed a law that every EU country, needs to put ranges down and to report their data. 21 out of the 38 OECD countries have laws. Our federal laws are really nowhere near where the city laws are. So I think when we're doing this work, we're doing this work to really move the needle for, everyone in the private sector, because the companies that I work with, they're multinational companies. They're all around the world. They're all around the country. And in the 4 million employees that are just in New York. So I just want to commend you all for the level of, knowledge and, I mean, you guys were really really on it, and I'm really, really excited about that. But let me talk you a little bit about where the private sector is. So the needle has moved on this very significantly in the last 5 years or so. I've been in my job for 6 years. In 2017, virtually no companies were doing pay audits. In fact, some of you may remember that Salesforce got this big write-up in Fortune magazine about how they had, Mark Benioff had done this, was a woman said, there's a disparity, and he did this whole analysis and found that he said, oh, no, it couldn't be. But yes, of course, there was a big disparity. It has spent $3 million to adjust the salaries. So since then, since he got all this notoriety, and then I think Citi got a big write-up, the last survey that we did within my organization, we have about 500 multinational companies. We have about 100 that are sign up to give us their data and know where they, so we can make some comparisons. 93% of them are doing pay audits. That's up from 82% the year before. So it's gone from almost zero to if you are a large multinational company, if you want to attract and retain employees, you're doing pay audits, and you're regularly every year looking at it and making adjustments to do it. And in this population, 58% of them disclose some of the data. Now, not all the data, some of it's represented, some of it's pay equity, it's EEOC data, but they're disclosing this. Now, virtually none of them were doing this 5 years ago. So, I have to say that this is really great news. Now, what is driving this revelation here? I do think, the regulation environment is making a difference. And I think that companies are understanding that to attract and retain employees, they have to start doing this work. And that has to do with the level of awareness around all of this, and especially Gen Z and, younger millennials expecting it. And feeling less inclined to work for people if they don't feel that they have a fair and equitable environment. And because we're in a full employment situation now, they have more mobility. So you're seeing the private sector move towards that. Now, unfortunately, the private sector is leading in many states, and certainly at the federal level, way ahead of the federal environment, but that's not true in Europe. So these multinational companies are also responding to the European regulation. And in the UK was a big leader of that. Now the EU is doing it. And there's also reports that show that in Europe, that these regulations are moving the needle for women and for diversity in general. So they are effective. And that's why people are continuing to do that. So, this is a positive note on the environment we're in and the expectations that allows us to do this work on a timely basis, and also for us in this room to really lead the way so that people understand, and can model it in different, around the country.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. So it sounds like there's a business case, there's a moral case, there's a values case to be made.
It's interesting. Catalyst just did some research, and we compared the business
Mhm.
case and the fairness case. There's two different ways people look at this. So both of them are really important. The business case is the ROI, and there's been a lot of work on that. And you'll find companies talking about the business case to certain constituents, to their investors and their business leaders. But the fairness case, the moral case, is the one that appeals to the employees. And that is, so they want to hear both of them, but people are deciding where to work, and they're staying in their work because of the fairness case.
Mhm. Thank you so much. I'm going to move us now to solutions really quickly before we open up for questions. So I'll turn to Sahir. You know, there are laws in the books. It sounds like we want to go from good to great to amazing. So how do we get there, Sahir?
So I wanted to start by recognizing, we passed push forward our first New York City pay transparency law, thanks to Councilmember Helen Rosenthal. She really led us at the state level. It was Assemblymember Latoya Joyner and Senator Jessica Ramos. We've had just incredible leadership on this. I think it is a remarkable thing to be doing this under Speaker Adams' City Council. We are so excited to be working with you to push this forward to the next step. Councilmember Brooks Powers is preparing to introduce legislation that will push our pay transparency legislation forward. And I will say what we've done so far is incredibly important, but there are gaps that we really need to work on filling, and they're important ones. So we're excited to do this work. We don't know what's going to be in the actual bill, but I will give you our wish list. So I think one thing we want to start with is that we anticipated that when our original law was enacted, what's required is that employers post a good faith salary range. We don't really know what good faith means. It's not clearly defined. It's not something, that has set parameters. And we were worried about it from the start. And what we have seen, unfortunately, since the law was enacted is that many employers who are not acting in good faith are posting embarrassingly broad salary ranges that essentially obscure what the true range is. And that thwarts transparency altogether, right? And I think one thing I try to point out about employers that are doing that is that for employees of those employers, you should be paying attention because there's a reason those employers are doing what they're doing, and there are questions about why they're doing it, right? We've seen so many employers, and Lorraine kind of laid this out, so many employers are acting in good faith. And so we need to make sure everyone gets there and that we are really pushing for transparency. And so one thing we want to see is the law amended to really set parameters on the types of ranges that employers post so that they can't post overbroad ranges. And so that they're really posting accurate ranges that reflect what they intend to pay for the position. Currently under the law, employers, it's also, a good faith range at the time of posting. I think a lot of employers have interpreted that to mean they can change the range after the fact if they find exceptional candidates. And while we understand the need to do so, I think if you pay outside the range after the fact, transparency is out the window because we don't know what you've paid. We don't know what the salary range is for the position. And so we really want employers to set the salary at the front end. If they have to change the salary based on factors that come up after the fact, repost so that we know what the range is. I think the next big piece, and I mentioned this kind of in talking about our pay equity laws, is that existing employees do not know what the pay disparities are within their organizations. And if we are going to address pay inequity, it's essential that they have access to this information. So we want to amend the law so that employers have to disclose this information to their current employees. A current employee should be able to go to their employer and ask what the current pay range is for their position. They should be able to get a job description for their position. And we have many women who call our helpline saying, I don't think I'm being paid fairly. I've asked my employer for this information and they refuse to provide it. Again, it's a shield. It prevents accountability and we need transparency. We need to shine the light there. And then I think another piece that's really important to talk about, and this is something we tried to push with the New York State law, but we didn't get there. We're hoping we get there now in New York City, is that one of the key drivers of pay inequity is not just pay disparities in base pay, it's disparities in other forms of compensation. We see this in bonuses and stock options in a variety of different ways. It's important that we have information about not just base pay, but information about broader forms of compensation. So for forms of compensation, I know in big Big law firms, they know what their bonuses are going to be upfront. They should be required to disclose what those bonuses are going to be. If it's a range, they should be required to disclose the range. And if it's stock options and other things, they should be required to disclose kind of a general description of what certain benefits are so that workers are on notice about what they need to keep track of in terms of determining whether they're being paid fairly. Benefits, another big piece. I mean, think about how many women start a job and do not feel comfortable asking whether or not their employer is going to offer paid family leave. And yet we constantly talk about the lack of paid family leave being a key driver of inequity. We don't want women to have to ask because we know they get retaliated against. We want that information to be disclosed in a job posting. We talked about how the New York State law, requires disclosure of job descriptions. This is a key way for people to know, where they fall when a salary range is disclosed. Where do I fall within the range? What are the qualifications? What are the expectations and skills that are being looked for? And for low-wage workers, we oftentimes see, and this is really for all workers, they oftentimes start a job and then their job duties expand slowly over time, right? That is essentially a form of wage theft. So it's very important to upfront have a job description that tells you what your duties are so that they don't expand over time while your pay stays the same, right? That's a way for people to advocate for themselves. And then I think that's all.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot. Not enough, but it's a lot. Thank you so much. So before I turn over to questions from the audience, so get your questions ready. I wanted to give the other panelists just a minute opportunity, lightning round, to just tell me, what's one important action in your purview that needs to happen on pay equity, whether it's from the government side, from the advocacy side, the business sector. Lorraine, why don't we start with you?
Well, while I talked about what the larger companies are doing that have the resources to do this, you alluded to it. The smaller companies have much less resources and much more, crunch to do this effectively. So I think having the laws and really be mindful of what they can report, what they can do, and make it easy for them would really help. Because you have 10 people in an organization. This can be a big burden.
Yeah, absolutely. Commissioner?
Sure. So, I shared our study, which is obviously very important to us. There's other efforts that have already happened through the cabinet, like upskilling HR teams, primers for employees to understand their compensation. And I think some of the other work that we're doing through our office, which is programmatic in nature, is focused on supporting young people of color to have career exploration programs and career training opportunities and real pathways to high wage careers, right? So also addressing the pipeline, but also making sure when people enter into their occupations, right, they're set up in equitable systems.
Absolutely. Sharon?
As we heard, some of the fastest growing occupations are, low wage, including home health aid, childcare, and human services. And so from where we sit at WCC, it's really, really important that women, especially women of color, understand the wage transparency law, that they're equipped and that they advocate for changes, both at work and the broader systemic changes. So our goal is to be able to continue to do the research, to be able to share that information, but also for women to be able to share their lived experience. So one example, one of our members was deprived of wages compared to their male counterpart over 22 years. That's an impact of $155,000, which means there's a difference in how she provides healthcare for her family, asset building in terms of purchasing a home, and just advancing sort of her community. So we want to be able to get more women involved, to be able to understand what's on the line, to be able to advocate for themselves, while also juggling multiple priorities.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you to everyone. So we'll open it up to questions. So any hands in the room? If not, I've got plenty more. Sure. If you can just say, right over, the mic's coming over to you. If you can just state your name and affiliation.
So, there's a lot of talk about the legislation, and I think it's important, right, because it sets the tone and it helps to shift things. But how do we also address the other cultural shifts that need to happen, right? One of the things we talked about, Sharon, was about the undervalued work, right? When we were talking about care work, right? Who's doing that work, and we make it, we talk about it in a way that any woman can come and do this training and do that. I'm not someone, that's not something that's in my disposition to do, and yet we talk about it, anyone can do it and it's unskilled, right? So how do we, I think there's a couple of shifts. The language that we use when we talk about unskilled work, right? And low skill, when we talk about it in schools, when we talk about it to students, when they're applying for jobs, and we talk about low skills, like we need to think about what that is indicating to folks, right? What's that indicating to folks that look like us here, right? In the panel, when we keep using that language, and so that's one. And also, if we're talking about that care work is undervalued, how do we start to talk about it in a way that's valued and in a way that also men want to engage and do that work, right? In spaces where men can take, paternity leave, and that is something that is reinforced, and they're able to spend time with their family and provide, right? That's going to change the dynamic of that workspace. So how do we make it seem that it's not, yes, we're talking about pay equity, and if you look here, who's mostly in the room, right? It's not just women. It's not just women that need to be at the table talking about it. So it is, how do we talk about the benefits for others when they step in and do their work, right? Like no different than when we're talking about equity and race, right? When we're talking about race and equity, we are asking people to have to let go of their privilege, and that means that they are losing something. We forget to acknowledge that loss, right? And it may seem like a petty loss because I've been having to put up with this for whatever, and now you lose your privilege, sucks for you, boo-hoo, but it is a loss, right? And people don't want to give things up. So how do we also, right, make sure that, because legislating alone doesn't do it. Legislating alone only creates resentment. It makes these people look, oh, another equity training. So how do we also make sure that we are shifting that into the culture of spaces of the legislation, of the discussions happening? And so I just think that we want to make sure that it's not just the one or the other. That part is really important because that's going to follow. Because people aren't going to want to do it just because they're dragging.
Thank you so much. That's such a critical question. My gosh, many questions within that. Thank you. Who wants to be the first to tackle that? Sharon?
I'll just quickly say thank you for the question and the points. Changing the narrative, changing the culture, that's really important. I just want to give an example. So for example, the city just, as a commissioner just said, that passed the COLA increase, right, for human services workers as part of the Just Pay campaign. What we have worked to do is to really educate folks about the value add that human services bring to the sector, and that it's a real strong, we're a real strong force in the city working with thousands of individuals and transform lives. So really working to change the narrative about how human services workers show up. And I think that it's an incremental when we call it, but that's an indication of both. That's a win, but it's far more than that in terms of the value add of the workers.
Yeah, I'll just kind of build on that real quickly. I'm a lawyer, so I still have to talk about legislation, but I feel like there, currently in the budget talks, there are these pushes to, increase pay for home care workers, for childcare workers. And I think that it's being led by home care workers, childcare workers, and oftentimes those who are receiving care. And so I think we're hearing those voices in a new way. We're really shifting towards bringing them forward and hearing from workers and changing the narrative. I think it's a bunch of different things together, right? And this idea of, we constantly say, we talk about equal pay for equal work. Bev often talks about equal pay for work of equal value. And so I think that starts with, Commissioner Sherman's initiative and things where we are going back and we're revaluing jobs, right? We're trying to look from the very beginning at what is the value added to our society from these jobs? And I do think that requires a whole new perspective on childcare and home care and these things that our economy relies upon and that requires so much work and effort and skill. And it is about changing the way we talk about it too.
Yeah.
Oh,
thank you.
and sorry, one thing I will add, and this is a separate issue, but so many of the women who are doing this work are working multiple jobs, and they are not doing it on wages that sustain them. And so a big piece that we often advocate for is that increasing our minimum wage, indexing it to cost of living. We've kind of moved one step forward in New York State on that, but moving us towards a living wage. I think it's hard for workers, women workers who are doing these hard jobs to be out there advocating when they don't have the time to even, like I said, sustain themselves. And so that's an essential piece. The minimum wage is a gender justice issue, and I think we need to shine more light on the fact that we need to push that forward.
Yeah, and just to add, I know we have another question. Just say I really, that resonates a lot, and I think it's also a values question and a cultural question. And it's something that I think that requires a paradigm shift that I think in many ways is happening now, but very slowly. When we think about care work, childcare, who takes your child, who takes your mom to a doctor's appointment? It's usually a woman. You know, like how do we think through that, and how do we change some of our cultural daily practices around that, and how does that get into the culture of organizations and businesses and government? I'm going to turn it to Solange, who also had a question.
So thank you, PowHer New York and CSS and LM. I don't think this program was long enough. The first thing, we should spend more time talking about this. Sahar, thank you so much for highlighting that the onus falls on the victim and not on the perpetrator. And that tends to be a problem in the United States. We're a laissez-faire culture. And I think that the onus has to come to the consumer, the employee and the consumer. And what we found at the conference board is that consumers care about this. 68% of the consumers that we surveyed said that they base their purchase intent based on how well companies treat their employees. So I think we need to have a lot more transparency about that. It can't fall on government to legislate because there are no teeth to the legislation. There are no penalties for breaking the law. So we need to mobilize as a society and make this a real issue for consumers, because consumers, when they have the dollar, they have the power. So how do we elevate that? How do we convince consumers that this is really important? And I don't think it's that hard because consumers are employees, right? So we have a shared interest. So can we learn something from what Iceland did? Right? The women in Iceland went on strike for 1 day a week because they were being paid 80% of men. So why aren't women creating collective action? And how do we do that? So maybe there's something there. And then I've had this idea for about, I don't know, maybe 10 years since I started working in this space, which is imposing a 15% tax on white men at the cash register. And I promise you, the day that that happens, the next day we're going to have pay parity. When it hurts white men, we get action. So how can we reframe the way we think about this issue so that we're not, you know, like the mouse just paddling away in the cream? Paddle hard enough, you know, it's from that movie. Anybody remember that movie? Where we actually get some traction.
So this is the consumer question. I want to take one more from the gentleman in the back. I want to make sure we have a men's voice in this room. So do you have a question?
To piggyback on the issue of reframing, I don't think the issue so much is pay transparency as it is resource allocation. Governor Hochul put it out there that there should be a bill tied to the rate of pay to the cost of inflation. There's a bill in Congress right now, it's stalled in the Senate, that says the earned child tax credit, again, should be tied to inflation. Issues not so much pay transparency as this resource allocation. We don't save money. Black women don't save money. Latino women don't save money. My mother didn't save money. I mean, it is about pay transparency, pay equity, but it's also about resource allocation and how can we step up our game in terms of that. Wealthiest people in this world, they don't worry about things like that. They have resources they can allocate to wherever they want to. I think it's more about resource allocation. And again, we should champion these bills that says tax credit tied to inflation, pay rate tied to inflation, and so on and so on and so forth.
Thank you for that. So we have the consumer question and the resource question. Who wants to take the consumer piece? Or, sure, resource question, please.
So I think it's both ends, right? I think that to your point, right, there is a need to consistently adjust wages, right, tax credits, et cetera, to not only inflation, but to our actual true cost of living, right? And so one of the other things that our office will be doing and issuing later this year is New York City's true cost of living report, right, which is required also for the city and would be an assessment of not who's in and who's out of poverty, but what does it cost to live in New York City with dignity? And I think that we know folks across many class categories in our city are struggling to make it, and pay is part of that, but costs are also a driver. And so there's that. I would still add that even with an adjustment in salary, an adjustment in tax credits, et cetera, with inflation or costs, there still is a gap by gender, there still is a gap by race. There's still ways in which that adjustment is still not equally distributed. So it's important that employees still understand what the compensation structure within their organization is, to make sure that they're being fairly compensated, even if, right, they're being compensated in a way that's better than before, or they're experiencing more prosperity. It still may not be equitable to what their counterparts are experiencing. And, collectively, this is how we all get ahead, right? Like just 2 nights ago, we had a public hearing for our Marshall Plans for Moms Task Force, which is another task force required by local laws. A lot of focus in the city council. That another task force that our Commissioner on Gender Equity is leading, required by local law, which includes a number of stakeholders, other city agencies. We had a public hearing where many parents, moms in particular, testified, right, about struggling to manage a variety of jobs and childcare needs, not being appropriately accommodated by their employers, not having the understanding that they need. Even if they're in a work at an employer that's paying them well, right, still having the workplace experience and the support that they need in the workplace to manage their second shift, right, with their childcare responsibilities, is still it's still a pay equity issue. And so these issues are all connected. And our ability to address them collectively really will help us all collectively. And so that's another report that we'll be issuing later this year from the task force, with a set of recommendations for New York City working moms, parents, and caregivers, addressing a myriad of these issues and how they're interconnected.
Thank you. Go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, I just want to quickly turn to my colleague, Nayela, who's in the room here, to talk a little bit about collective action. I think that as we see that women, especially women of color, have to work multiple jobs to make work pay, and then to be able to juggle multiple sort of after work responsibilities, it is more challenging to get that collective action that you're talking about. But I'll just quickly, I know we have to wrap up, but I'll turn to Nayela just to quickly talk about that collective action.
Absolutely. Good morning. I am Nayela Amaru, VP of Policy and Advocacy for Women Creating Change. And I come from over 2 decades of working on issue campaigns through the lens of grassroots movements and more organized coalitions and short-term alliances. And if there's one thing that I've learned, is that elected officials don't pass bills, coalitions do. And the best bills always come from the grassroots, because that's where the collective action drives the issue framing. To Erica's point, how we talk about the issues. Who has the power to define the problem has the power to define the solution. And that's where our lived experiences in the diversity of our perspectives through a sustained process of changing the narrative, of telling our stories on our terms, on our words, building strategic partnerships with folks in government who have the formal process to introduce bills to, for the most part, control the implementation. Our collaboration of working across our silos is key to building our power that change the material conditions of our lives, particularly for those women. Our focus is women at WCC, but for all New Yorkers who come from underserved communities. I will just add that to the conversation is that our power is in our collective action and to change the structural and societal issues that are the root of a lot of the issues that we've discussed today. The power to change that is within this room and the communities that we come from. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I want to thank our panelists for their tremendous knowledge and their expertise and for sharing that with us today. I want to add just one quick point on the collective piece because I think it's important. I always reflect on the civil rights movement in our country, particularly Black civil rights. And I don't think there's a stronger example than the Montgomery bus boycott. Where we withhold our money and we're not riding the buses and we get change. So we have to think about, you know, how we're withholding our power, how we're withholding our money on consumers to get things done. I'm going to pass it to Bev for our call to action. Thank you.
Right, so thank you so much for this amazing panel. Can we give them a round of applause? Amazing. So now we have a lot more work to do. We have to do strike, right? We have to do, and that's the nature of this work. That we started this, I said 18 years ago, but I want to tell you, it didn't start 18 years ago. In New York State, it started in 1980s. And it was about equal pay for what we called comparable worth. Now we call it equal pay for work of equal value. And here we are at that really critical issue again. So this work takes a lot of time, takes a lot of, you know, experts, a lot of engagement, a lot of collective action, but we're doing it. You know, we're doing it, and New York is moving forward, and it is ahead of the curve, but we can do more. And so that's the call to action. In this wonderful pamphlet, there's how can you take action? It's one of the last sheets. It says report something if you see it that it's wrong, share this information, get advice if you need advice on some of these issues. And the last one is to advocate. And that's our specialty, to do collective action. And I think what we've decided here, you know, we need to increase the transparency. We need to engage business more as partners in this work. But at the heart of the matter, we also need to value women's work. And we have to value caregivers. And that's one of the biggest drivers of the pay gap. This happens only because of partnership. And so again, I want to just thank all our speakers who are our partners, CSS, Legal Momentum, particularly on this particular event. And one last thought is that we have been moving forward, but there is no guarantee that we're going to continue moving forward. The forces are pushing against us more than ever. We don't know what's going to happen, so we really have to redouble our efforts, commit to moving this issue. And one of the ways that we can ensure our rights would be passing the New York State Equal Rights Amendment. So that's just one thing. Keep it on your radar, learn about it, do what you can if you agree. And then hopefully in November, people will flip the ballot and we will pass an Equal Rights Amendment in New York that will not be for women only, but for all protected categories, for all New York folks. And that's the way we make the kind of deep systemic change and ensuring that it continues that we actually need. So thank you everybody for being part of this conversation, being part of the movement. And we're going to continue. We've got our work ahead of us and we're going to do it all together. Thank you so much. Sign the petition for the ERA information here.